So that's the case of Kyrgyzstan, which is one of the brighter sides of Central Asia. Then we'll get to Kazakhstan in a few minutes. But certainly from a democracy perspective, it's always been seen as the one that has the greatest potential. And so you see that greatest potential hasn't gone very far. It's what we would call a soft authoritarian regime. Now we move to Uzbekistan. Kyrgyzstan had its tulip revolution, and that was enough to convince authoritarians in the region that Georgia and Ukraine were not flukes, that no one's secure, and also that the West is the enemy. Everyone threw this back. I mentioned that the Western NGOs really had very little to do with this, probably practically nothing. But the common conception here, misconception really, was that the West orchestrated these things. And so all of the regional powers, from Russia down to all the other Central Asian states, are very wary of the West and wary of another revolution coming up. And Andijan, the events of Andijan are symptomatic of this. The Andijan events happened just a couple months after the Kyrgyz events. So here again, we're talking about political disturbances where protests turn violent. The political disturbances were really rooted in freedom of religion. There was a prison break for a group that was accused of religious extremism, and largely they were accused of religious extremism because they were wealthy businessmen who were providing to religious organizations and others. So they were basically giving lots of charity to religious organizations. And their goal was to really pick up where the Soviet Union had broken down, to help religious organizations provide daycare, soup kitchens, medical care. The real crime of these guys who broke out of prison was that they were more legitimate and more popular than the regime. They were an alternative to the incumbent. In other words, an alternative to Karimov and a threat to him as a result. So what happened is protesters seized the Andijan government offices by force. The local government had really been up to no good, and so people went off against them. Many people heard about the protests in the central square, and they came. And the people had numerous grievances. Socioeconomic grievances. Healthcare was horrible. Schools were shoddy. Forced labor in the cotton economy. Poverty. Corruption. These weren't overt political demands. They were about declining living standards. No one said, we want Karimov out. Far from that. In fact, many of the people probably supported Karimov, but they blamed the local administration for all the problems that they were feeling. The Uzbek government, though, responded by trying to nip this in the bud. They brought in Uzbek forces, they surrounded the square, and they shot. And this resulted officially in 178 deaths, unofficially in 1,000 plus deaths. Uzbekistan has not allowed for an independent investigation since the actual events occurred, claiming that the quote-unquote independent investigations are actually biased. So how does Andijan fit or not fit with the colored revolution model? Well, it fits in the way that it was just a couple months after Kyrgyzstan and that there were widespread grievances from the population, but it doesn't fit in a lot of ways. First, you have the role of violence. You have this prison break that occurs, and then people gather to support these guys in a public square. They were spontaneous. They weren't well organized. They weren't orchestrated around anything. And the timing was also different. They weren't orchestrated around elections as typical. So all these things are quite different than the color revolutions. They were quite distinct. Although perhaps they gained some of their following from the fact that events in Kyrgyzstan had happened the way they had. In other words, people who were angry were able to stand up for the first time in Central Asia and make a difference. So what do these events mean for Uzbek foreign policy? Well, Karimov saw this as a revolution, and he was certain that it was backed by the West, especially U.S.-funded NGOs. No evidence for this whatsoever. In fact, I'm not aware of any NGOs who were at all involved in this, even sort of tag-along NGOs like we saw in Kyrgyzstan. In the subsequent crackdown, though, the Uzbeks kicked out many non-governmental organizations. And many Uzbeks from the Andijan area fled. Some were deported back to Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. Some were deported by Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan back to Uzbekistan. But people fled to other places like Russia as well. Throughout this, the diplomatic pendulum swung much further to Russia. In other words, Uzbek foreign policy was moving far away from the U.S. foreign policy. And remember, as I mentioned before, in the Uzbek case, when we talked about foreign policy, once the U.S. went into Iraq and became less interested in Afghanistan, the Uzbeks really lost their big card. and so Andijan was sort of the time when everyone showed their cards, and the U.S. said, "Okay, we can kick you around again, and we're going to." The Uzbeks have also been wary of going too close to Russia, and so they've moved much closer through multilateral organizations. And one of the things that's come in has been peoples, has been China, which seems to be taking the U.S.'s place. It's increasingly wealthy, it's got a huge market, and it's definitely interested in Central Asia now. So Andijan was the breaking point for relations with much of the West, which, having gotten into Iraq, was no longer interested in Uzbekistan as a partner, and it was a convenient sort of whipping post for us. Besides that, though, Andijan didn't really change too much for President Karimov. It was really back to business, the business of being an authoritarian ruler. Since 1991, and then even more since 2001, and especially since Andijan of 2005, the quote-unquote war on terror, or other names for it, has been used to justify repressive policies and a lack of political liberalization. Now, the economy today still remains heavily dependent on the export of cotton, gold, and natural gas, and to a lesser extent oil. There are lots of problems in the economy, starting with the continued use of forced labor in the cotton market. In essence, what the government's doing, the government owns all the cotton, and it uses forced labor to pick it, meaning it's dirt cheap. And then they sell it for high prices on the world market, and they use the proceeds to balance the budget to a certain extent, and also pad their own personal bank accounts. And this points to a more general problem, dependence on basic commodities, which means that basic commodities are easy to hijack. They're easy to fill the pockets of those in charge while the population struggles. Average Uzbeks get by, but they get by leaving the country, having at least one breadwinner send back remittances. Those in the country have really little benefit from the country's natural resources, which are A, designed for export, and B, extracted through antiquated Soviet technology that's more and more failing. In 2012, for instance, oil production fell by about 12%. And without investment, Uzbekistan can't realize its potential in particular in the gas sphere, and cotton as well. Another interesting aspect here is that the economy has been under the thumb of a very small group of elites, including the security services, and up until recently, President Karimov's daughter, Gulnora, who everyone, when I was there, thought that Gulnora was going to be the one who sort of inherited the Uzbek presidency, the likely heir to the Uzbek presidency. Now, Gulnora has a massive business empire of her own. At least she did, up until a family feud in 2013 appears to have knocked her out. Her TV and radio stations were closed down. There were reports that followed of her fighting. She put out reports that her bodyguards had been arrested and were being tortured by the Uzbek secret security services. Really, though, a lack of transparency leaves people guessing about what's really happening in Uzbekistan. But what's clear is that it seems like Gulnora's on the out. The reason I mention this is that it's been sort of it's important to understand in general that the sort of personality politics in Central Asia, and also the role of these clans, which I mentioned before, and of families. So the U.S. economy, I should say, has had decent growth over the last decade and a half, thanks to high cotton and gas prices. Now, it's hard to figure out how much people are actually earning on a sort of income per capita basis, like we have for Kyrgyzstan, that $920, and the other countries that I'll talk about. But what is available suggests that the Uzbeks are trailing the Kazakhs, whose incomes appear to be about 4 times plus higher. And this is troubling for the Uzbeks because they've always considered themselves to be the center of Central Asia. They're the largest by population country, and they've always considered themselves to be the geopolitical key to Central Asia. Now, going back to the political opposition remains outlawed. Human rights activists are harassed. They're often severely repressed. Uzbekistan is routinely accused of torture. This was the case. There was the case when I was there of the Uzbeks boiling an oppositionist alive in the infamous Jazak jail. There have been recent reports, including the burning of genitals and other forms of torture. the political opposition in exile came together in a new organization in 2011, hoping to actually gain from the momentum of the Arab Spring, which I've alluded to several times by mentioning Egypt. They created this alliance of sorts, but it's an alliance among the very disparate and often feuding elites. These guys have never gotten along very well together, this people's movement of Uzbekistan that they created. There's very little information about them in Uzbekistan itself, so no one knows that there's this real opposition that exists. And Uzbek leaders, following their traditional pattern, use the official press to condemn them as a terrorist organization. So what little people do know, they think of this people's movement of Uzbekistan as a threat. They actually took it a step further and brought in a new reference point, Syria. Right? Tajikistan's doing fine, but now we've got in Afghanistan's, well, Afghanistan's Afghanistan. But anyway, we've got something new, something brimming, something even worse, which is Syria. And the official press has claimed recently that the People's Movement of Uzbekistan has decided consciously to bring civil war to Uzbekistan in order to root out Karimov. So that's Uzbekistan today. Let me take Kazakhstan on a separate slide.